This is our Merleau Ponty reading group. We are continuing our reading of The Structure of Behavior. We are on chapter 3 out of the, I think, 4 chapters of this book, so the long chapters. Again, sort of situating where we are in the structure of the book. So this chapter is looking at these three orders of reality, or three sort of areas of inquiry. So the physical order, the vital order, and I think he used the term human order for the third one. Human order. So like obviously all living beings, anything in this vital order, are also physical. So any organism is composed of matter in space and time. So you can take the body of some organism and break it down into its chemical constituents and so on. But then the question is, what is it that makes certain combinations of chemicals or bits of matter living beings and other ones not? What's the difference between the two? And so like one approach would be to say that there's something extra added on this vital force or whatever you want to call it, that like for whatever reason that certain portions of matter are associated with something non-material or something that is not made up of matter, that sort of animates that portion of matter and makes it into a living being. So this, I mean, this is like, I guess, vitalism as a sort of intellectual project that has been pursued in different forms in over history. But the sort of recurring objection to this sort of postulation of something non-material as being what animates some portions of matter is that it doesn't really explain anything. You're essentially just giving a name to the problem, or putting a label on the problem. Like you say, like, what is it that makes this portion of matter alive and this other one not? And you say, oh, it's the vital force that does it. And then when you want to know what the vital force is, you say it's the principle or whatever that makes certain things alive. So the content of the concept of vital force is sort of exhausted by the capacity to make something alive. So the explanation sort of goes in a circle. And so like so many researchers had sort of criticized this form of explanation as not really explaining anything, and tried to pursue I guess a mechanistic approach and trying to reduce the vital order, or see the vital order, or the organization of living beings as being in principle explicable in terms of the interaction of matter in some specific form. So that a certain portion of matter or a certain organism is alive insofar as its constituents are structured in a certain way and interact in certain ways, and those structures and interactions can in principle be described in purely physical terms and without reference to anything non-material or non-physical, like a vital force. This is like maybe the more mainstream approach in biology, or in the study of this relationship between the vital and the physical order. But of course, the problem with this approach is that this sort of in principle part is never fully sort of realized. That, like, of course, we know that there are many phenomena of living beings that can be explained in mechanical terms, that we have good explanations for how they work in as like interactions of chemicals. But there are also countless phenomena having to do with living beings that have not yet been explained in mechanical terms, and so we just have to have this sort of faith that we will be able to carry out this explanation in mechanical terms. So we don't have like a sort of definitive account of life or of the vital order in these mechanical terms, and we just have to sort of hope that one day we will have this account. And then there's maybe more like sort of principled objections that Merleau-Ponty goes through here, namely that when we start doing research on living beings, just by like picking what things we think are going to be important, or like isolating certain factors as like this is the thing we want to study, we're already sort of presupposing some kind of understanding of this living being as a living being, and not just as a sort of assemblage of chemicals interacting in various ways. So like we like when you study animal behavior, for example, you study it in terms of how the animal finds its food, how it avoids predators, etc. These are all sort of intrinsically biological concepts. These are concepts that have to do with the vital order as such, and not with some interaction of chemicals. So if you don't sort of bring these concepts from the vital order to your study of the organism, then you have no like principled way of um, picking out the interactions of chemicals that constitute the behavior of finding food, for example, as opposed to any of the billions of other potential interactions of chemicals that you could study. So just the fact of like isolating or focusing on the biologically relevant forms of transformation of this material system that we recognize as a living being, just that sort of focus on the sort of life course of the organism already sort of relies on some sort of understanding of the living being as a living being, and not just as a portion of matter, or interacting chemicals or whatever. So I guess so, yeah, so like the sort of yeah, that's a good example. So yeah, you can think of all sorts of bizarre experiments that you could perform on organisms to study their chemical interactions. So if you launch a turtle into Jupiter's atmosphere, you could study what happens to the turtle's shell when it comes into contact with the gases that make up the atmosphere of Jupiter. But this is like completely meaningless from a biological perspective, because turtles obviously do not uh, normally explore Jupiter's atmosphere. So yeah, like in principle, there's no that we know of. There may be turtle astronauts that we haven't discovered yet. But yeah, so in principle, if you're just interested in if you think that you can sort of reduce biology to chemistry, or the vital order to the physical order in that way, then you have no sort of principled way of distinguishing between these absurd experiments that have no biological relevance, and then the sort of important biological experiments about like how the turtle I don't know, assimilates vitamins from its food and so on. So these are like just the selection of the types of chemical processes that are actually important to the life of a turtle and help you understand how a turtle survives and reproduces and so on, versus all the completely irrelevant chemical interactions that the turtle could potentially be involved in. This distinction is already sort of implies a kind of I don't know, self-subsistence, I guess, of the vital order. That like the vital order itself is something that that you have to recognize as having reality, as opposed to just being a sort of description of the physical order. Okay, yeah, so we can pick up from there. I think that's more or less where we ended last time. So so we are at page 159 of the translation, right at the top of the page. So for those following along, and yes, we can start from there and read a page or so.
I can read. In reality, the two arguments consider the organism as a real product of an external nature, when in fact it is a unity of signification, a phenomenon in the Kantian sense. It is given in perception with the original characteristics which we have described. Scientific knowledge finds physico-chemical relations in it and little by little invests it with them. A counterforce which would intervene to break these correlations is inconceivable. But nothing forces us to think that the cycle of physico-chemical actions can completely enclose the phenomenon of the organism, that explanation can rejoin the givens of the description, or that the phenomenal body can be converted into a physical system and integrated into the physical order. The totality is not an appearance, it is a phenomenon. If it is impossible to affirm in principle a discontinuity of physical correlations throughout this phenomenon, the affirmation of a real continuity is not any more permissible. Vital acts have a meaning. They are not defined, even in science, as a sum of processes external to each other, but as the spatial and temporal unfolding of certain ideal unities. Quote, every organism, unquote, said Erskine, quote, is a melody which sings itself, unquote. This is not to say that it knows this melody and attempts to realize it. It is only to say that it is a whole which is significant for a consciousness which knows it, not a thing which rests in itself, en soi. We cannot maintain that certain, quote, centers of indetermination, unquote, appear in the universe of physical causality. Let us say rather that our external experience is that of a multiplicity of structures, of significant wholes. Some, which will constitute the physical world, find the adequate expression of their internal unity in a mathematical law. Others, which are called living beings, present the particularity of having behavior, which is to say that their actions are not comprehensible as functions of the physical milieu, and that, on the contrary, the parts of the world to which they react are delimited for them by an internal norm. By quote-unquote norm, here one does not mean a quote-unquote should be, which would make it be. It is the simple observation of a preferred attitude, statistically more frequent, which gives a new kind of unity to behavior. One needs to introduce an active principle of order and entelechy only when one tries to compose the organism by means of the summation of separated processes, for it is then that the whole, with its remarkable constants, seems to demand an ordering factor which maintains them. From the moment that causality loses its mythical meaning of productive causality, to be reduced to the functional dependence of variables, laws can no longer be conceived as that which engenders the existence of the facts. One can no longer say, as M. Lepic writes, that order is an effect of the mechanisms by which it is realized. This would be to offer a support to the vitalist argumentation and to return to the antinomies. Nor is order that which calls the mechanisms into existence. The whole in the organism is an idea, as Spinoza thought. However, while Spinoza believed he was able to rediscover the unity of the body beyond the fragmented extension of the imagination in a law homogeneous with the law of physical systems, it does not seem possible to understand life by a regressive analysis which goes back to its conditions. It will be a question of a prospective analysis which will look for the immanent signification of life, the latter again being no more a force of attraction than cause is a force of propulsion. Quote-unquote signification is to the final cause what the relation of function to variable is to the, quote, producing cause, unquote. Following M. Brunschvig's expression, the laws of physics presuppose the observation of a de facto state of our universe. An event can be deduced with necessity only from another given event, without the contingents of that which exists, each time pushed further back, ever being eliminated from the whole. Similarly, the ideal structure of behavior allows us to link the present state of the organism with a prior state as given, to see in the former the progressive realization of an essence already legible in this latter, without our ever being able to go beyond the limit or make of the idea a cause of existence. So, yeah, this is obviously a phenomenological solution to this antinomy between materialism and vitalism. Merleau-Ponty thinks this idea of something that would interrupt the series of causal explanations is not realistic. There isn't some kind of vital order in the organism itself. It's that the organism, like everything else from Merleau-Ponty, is sort of originally, I guess, a structure in perception, or a structure in the perceptual field, and that's what gives it that is where it has its unity as an organism, which can then be understood physicochemically, but in a way that will never eliminate the structure which appears as an organism, which is not merely physicochemical. I think that the point about centers of indetermination is a swipe at Bergson, and so at the vitalist prong of the antinomy.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I think, yeah, so this notion of a melody, it comes up again. We've talked about this several times over the course of this reading. And so yeah, he's citing Euclid here about this notion of the organism as a melody. And so what is like, as we talked about in previous sessions, but like what's significant for this notion of a melody for Merleau-Ponty is that it has a sort of intrinsic structure. You can't sort of reduce a melody to like this atomic note, this like single note, and then sort of add relations onto it or connect it with other notes afterwards. The melody as such is intrinsically something that has to do with the connections between one note and the next. And so like, and this was of course a sort of one of the like basic discoveries of Gestalt psychology was this idea that like, for example, you can recognize a simple melody even as the same melody, even when it's played in a different key, so that each individual note is completely different than any note in the first one, but it's the same melody. So you're grasping the melody as this structure, as opposed to some sort of like association, this sort of habit forming process where one note makes you think of the next note, for example. So yeah, this notion of this sort of intrinsic structure that is not reducible to some sort of pattern imposed on the elements is sort of what he takes this melodic nature of the organism to consist in. So the yeah, like the life course of an organism is not just like a sequence of sort of individual moments that have this I guess like statistical tendency for one to lead to the next, for example. And so that, yeah, this is something that's come. I think we talked about this in a previous session as well. But like in philosophy of biology, there's been some discussion about how concepts like a function of an organism of an organ within an organism, or like the function of a certain behavior of the organism. This notion of function has this sort of normative character to it, in the sense that it has to do with sort of this idea of what the organ should do, even if in reality, if you like statistically analyze the real functioning of this organism in many instances of this the function of the organ within many instances of this organism, it might be the case that most of the time, or even the vast majority of time, it doesn't actually perform that function. So like one of the sort of stock examples is that like many insects will lay thousands of eggs, but the population of insects of that type remains more or less stable over time, meaning that most of those eggs, like some of them will be eaten before they hatch, some of the larvae will be eaten before they can develop into adults, many of the adults won't end up reproducing, etc. So like this sort of normal life cycle of the organism reproduces, lays eggs, the eggs hatch into larvae, and then the larvae transform into the adult form, and then they reproduce. This sort of life cycle of like what is supposed to happen, or the norm, is actually statistically much rarer than the being eaten before being able to reproduce, for example. So you can't sort of reduce this like function of reproduction, or this sort of norm of the life cycle of the organism, to just like a statistical property of like this is the most common sort of set of events that happen in space and time, because it's actually not the most common. So yeah, so like if we want to account for something like the idea that the organism has a function of reproduction, or that like reproduction has this sort of norm of this life cycle of the organism, we have to, yeah, we can't account for this in sort of purely mechanistic terms of like just looking at what actually happens, and statistical frequencies of patterns of events and so on. We have to sort of grasp something like this melodic structure of like this is a sort of pattern that is intrinsic to the organism, even if many other factors lead to that pattern not actually being realized in the majority of cases. Yeah, so this sort of intrinsic patterning, or this immanent pattern of this melodic structure of the organism is what we are supposed to sort of substitute for this opposition between like this purely mechanistic account of what actually happens in space and time, and like statistical relations between these different events on the one hand, and then this sort of supposition of a vital interruption of this interruption of mechanism through like a vital force or something along those lines. Yeah, so this notion is supposed to sort of get us past that opposition. Okay, yeah, so yeah, let's go on to the next bit. So yeah, we're passing from the vital order to the next heading here is the human order. If someone else would like to read.
Yeah, I can read. Okay. The human order. In describing the physical or organic individual and its milieu, we have been led to accept the fact that their relations were not mechanical but dialectical. A mechanical action, whether the word is taken in a restricted or looser sense, is one in which the cause and the effect are decomposable into real elements, which have a one-to-one correspondence. In elementary actions, the dependence is unidirectional. The cause is the necessary and sufficient condition of the effect, considered in its existence and its nature. And, even when one speaks of reciprocal actions between two terms, it can be reduced to a series of unidirectional determinations. On the contrary, as we have seen, physical stimuli act upon the organism only by eliciting a global response, which will vary qualitatively when the stimuli vary quantitatively. With respect to the organism, they play the role of occasions rather than of cause. The reaction depends on the vital significance rather than on the material properties of the stimuli. Hence, between the variables upon which conduct actually depends and this conduct itself, there appears a relation of meaning, an intrinsic relation. One cannot assign a moment in which the world acts on the organism, since the very effect of this quote-unquote action expresses the internal law of the organism. The mutual exteriority of the organism and the milieu is surmounted along with the mutual exteriority of the stimuli. Thus, two correlatives must be substituted for these two terms, defined in isolation, the quote-unquote milieu and the quote-unquote aptitude, which are like two poles of behavior and participate in the same structure. It is this intrinsic connection which Bergson expresses when he finds in instinct a relation of sympathy, quote unquote, with its object, or cooler, when he writes that each part of a form, quote unquote, dynamically knows the other parts. In speaking here of knowledge and consequently of consciousness, we are not constructing a metaphysics of nature. We are limiting ourselves to denominating the relations of the milieu and the organism as science itself denies them. As science itself defines them as they should be denominated. In recognizing that behavior has a meaning and depends upon the vital significance of situations, biological science is prohibited from conceiving of it as a thing in itself, en soi, which would exist partes extra partes in the nervous system or in the body. Rather, it sees in behavior an embodied dialectic which radiates over a milieu immanent to it. I can keep reading the next paragraph, maybe?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. There is no question, as we have said often enough, of returning to any form whatsoever of vitalism or animism, but simply of recognizing that the object of biology cannot be grasped without the unities of signification which a consciousness finds and sees unfolding in it. Open quotes. The mind of nature is a hidden mind. It is not produced in the form of mind itself. It is only mind for the mind which knows it. It is mind in itself, but not for itself. End quote. In reality, then we have already introduced a consciousness, and what we have designated under the name of life was already the consciousness of life. Open quotes. The concept is only the interior of nature. End quotes, says Hegel. And already it has seemed to us that the notion of the living body could not be grasped without this internal unity of signification, which distinguishes a gesture from a sum of movements. The phenomenon of life appeared therefore as at the moment when a piece of extension, by the disposition of its movements, and by the allusion that its movement makes to all the others, turned back upon itself and began to express something, to manifest an interior being externally. Do I finish here or do I keep going?
Yeah, I think it's a good point to stop.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so here he's sort of summarizing what we've taken from the last section on the vital order. So it's this notion of like this sort of irreducible patterning of the vital order. So with the organism, the behavior and sort of life course of an organism is something that is intrinsically structured and not reducible to this sort of sequence of spatial-temporal events with like statistical likelihood of one leading to the next, for example. So yeah, we have to understand the vital order in terms of this sort of intrinsic relation between the organism and its milieu, where we're here, each of these poles of this relation is constituted in relation to the other. So there only is a certain milieu in relation to the organism that lives in it. So like, like for example, the magnetic field of the Earth is not a part of the environment for of the milieu for most animals, but there are certain animals that seem to be sensitive to it and use it for navigation, for example. And so for those organisms, the magnetic field is, in fact, a part of their milieu. But like for humans, the polarization of light is not a part of our milieu. It's something we can only detect using, specific instruments. But bees, for example, use the polarization of light as a way of measuring the angle of the rays of the sun and using that for navigation. So for them, it is a part of their milieu. So it's only in this relationship between the organism and its environment that there is anything like this milieu. And then conversely, of course, an organism is only able to perform its behaviors and even to survive insofar as it exists in an environment that supports its life functions. Like obviously things like air, food, etc., are essential to ensuring the survival of organisms, and all the behaviors that an organism performs to secure things like food and all the other things that it needs. These behaviors are only possible if the environment in which it finds itself, offers those opportunities. And so, like as we saw at great length in the earlier parts of the book, organisms that are in this like laboratory environment that's very deprived environment that's very different from their normal environment, capable of performing the kinds of behaviors that they are capable of performing in a more sort of normal environment. So yeah, each of these terms is constituted by its relation to the other. So this has so there's a certain conceptual or like intellectual structure of this relationship. So like we can grasp the organism as, or this organism milieu relationship as being a kind of idea, a kind of intellectual structure, as opposed to this purely mechanical connection between different chemical substances. But at the same time, we are not sort of attributing like an awareness of this conceptual structure to the organism milieu pair. So obviously, a bee that is using the polarization of light to navigate is not like thinking about this. I'm seeing the polarization of sunlight, and therefore the angle to return to my my hive is pi over 2 or whatever. So the sort of bee sunlight pair embodies this conceptual relationship between the polarization of light and they don't have to study trigonometry in as they're developing from the larval form to the adult form. But yeah, so the bee sunlight pair sort of embodies this conceptual relationship of like the angle of the sunlight and so on, and the polarization of light. But the bee itself is not aware of this conceptual relationship. It just sort of manifests it through its behavior. And so we can say that the bee sunlight pair is conceptual in itself. So it realizes this conceptual relationship, but it's not conceptual for itself. It doesn't sort of experience or have an awareness of this conceptual nature of the relationship. And so it's only for us as the observer standing outside of this relationship that this conceptual relationship is manifested for itself, or becomes something that is explicit. but then yeah, so we'll go on to the next bit about like how this changes at the level of the human order, because of course humans are sometimes aware of these kinds of conceptual relationships. So like whether it's a family relationship or whatever, like you aren't just sort of related to your parents or your children or your partner or whatever in this sort of implicit way or in itself way. You are also aware of what kind of relationship you have to that person, and that awareness affects how you treat that person, how that other person treats you, etc. So like this sort of explicit nature uh, of the concept that is realized in that relationship is partly constitutive of what that relationship is, and so this human order has this sort of for itself nature that is distinct from the in itself nature of the vital order. Yeah, and so yeah, just to respond to Bat's comment here about like the bees, concepts and so on. Like this is like one of the sort of uh, basic problems in studying animal behavior. Of course, that like we might sort of look at the bee's behavior and say, oh, the bee knows which direction to fly to return to its hive or whatever. But we have no like figuring out what exactly the bee is sort of using to perform that navigation is much more difficult than just being able to describe, sort of the like external account of like what the results of that behavior is, and many times it like we might have like a preconception of like what it is that we think the animal should be like responding to in the environment to perform this navigation or whatever the behavior is. But when you start like systematically varying the different factors in the environment, it turns out that the animal is actually responding to a very different structure of the environment or pattern of the environment than we would expect. So yeah, like the fact that bees are responding to polarization of light is not something that you would ever sort of guess like just by watching a bee returning to its hive. You have to like try all kinds of different things and see which ones affect the bee's navigation and which ones don't, and then realize that this polarization of light is bringing about this or if you artificially vary the polarization of light, then you can affect the way that the bee navigates and returns to its hive. And then if you I don't know change other factors, the bee doesn't make any. There's no difference in the behavior of the bee, and so you can say that that factor doesn't contribute to the bee's navigation. But yeah, it's like figuring out what aspects of the environment or what patterns in the environment the animal is responding to is extremely difficult, and you can't just sort of presuppose that it's the one that the important factors are the ones that seem important to us as humans. Yeah, and then yeah, so and then Angus's comment here about the cat. So the cat or your pets in general might be able to sort of catch on to particular patterns of gestures that you sort of engage in. That like when this gesture happens, that means that the food is going to come out or whatever. So they sort of pick up on these patterns, and so they're like responding. You can give like a sort of conceptual account of what they're responding to, but of course they're not like they're not like aware of something like a concept that this gesture means food or whatever. They're just sort of picking up on these uh, patterns of connections between events, but they're not like aware that that's what they're doing. So yeah, it's this sort of implicit awareness of a conceptual structure without being aware of that conceptual structure as a concept. Okay, we can go on to the next bit, and I will read this one. If now we continue our description, always from the point of view of the quote unquote outside spectator, and if we consider the human order, we will at first see in it only the production of new structures. If life is the manifestation of an interior, of a quote interior in the quote exterior, consciousness is nothing at first but the projection onto the world of a new quote unquote milieu, irreducible to the preceding ones, it is true, and humanity nothing but a new species of animal. In particular, perception should be integrated in its turn into the dialectic of actions and reactions. While the physical system equilibrates itself in respect to the given forces of the milieu, and the animal organism constructs a stable milieu for itself corresponding to the monotonous a prioris of need and instinct, human work inaugurates a third dialectic. For between man and the physical chemical stimuli, it projects quote unquote use objects, Gebrauchobjekt, to be Gebrauchobjekte, I think, clothing, table, gardens, and quote unquote cultural objects, books, musical instruments, language, which constitute the proper milieu of man and bring about the emergence of new cycles of behavior. Just as it seemed to us to be impossible to reduce the pair vital situation instinctive reaction to the pair stimulus reflex, just so it will doubtless be necessary to recognize the originality of the pair perceived situation work. I don't have the French book right in front of me, but I think work here is œuvre rather than like travail or something along those lines. But yeah, I'll have to check that later. Okay. It is by design that instead of speaking of action as do most contemporary psychologists, we choose the Hegelian term work, which designates the ensemble of activities by which man transforms physical and living nature. For although nothing is more common than to link consciousness and action, it is rare that human action is taken with its original meaning and its concrete content. The pure image of matter and memory is accompanied by consciousness of itself at the moment when the physical forces, instead of passing through the body and releasing automatic responses in it, are dissipated in a quote unquote center of indetermination, that is, in a being capable of action proper. And thus, the zone of our possible action will be marked out in detail by our perception. But the action of which Bergson is thinking is always vital action, that by which the organism maintains itself in existence. In the act of human work, in the intelligent construction of instruments, he sees only another manner of attaining the ends which instinct pursues in its way. In both cases, there are, quote, two equally elegant solutions to the same problem, unquote. Beyond biological action, there remains only a mystical action which is directed to no determinate object. Properly human acts, the act of speech, of work, the act of clothing oneself, for example, have no significance in their own right. They are understood in reference to the aims of life. Clothing is an artificial skin, an instrument replaces an organ, language is a means of adaptation to the quote unquote unorganized mass. There is more. Although one finds in the conception of quote unquote kinetic melodies a concrete description of consciousness in action, of the internal unity and the meaning of gestures, Bergson sometimes returns to a purely motor notion of action. Habit is finally only the quote fossilized residue of a mental activity, unquote. The act of gesture only a quote motor accompaniment, unquote, of thoughts, and the practical aims of consciousness are reduced to the consciousness of quote incipient movements, unquote. In the same manner, Janet's reality function in the final analysis is the consciousness of certain displacements of our members, since the system of tendencies which governs them is, according to the author, only a representational hypothesis. Moreover, if it were realized in consciousness, the relation of these natural forces and the thinking subject would scarcely be conceivable. But the purely motor notion of action which psychologists make use of is accepted by philosophy just as it is. Quote, this is a long quote here. Quote, following reflexive analysis, the psychologically simple, the specifically irreducible element of perception is the affirmation which confers existence in the proper sense. It is the judgment, this is. Considered in itself, such a judgment doubtless implies no determination of any content whatsoever. The critical elimination of the successive contributions of memory and intelligence reduces the initial consciousness of the fact of experience, that sort of instantaneous shock of fugitive sting which we experience when, in the night, we believe without being completely sure of it that we have glimpsed a flash or heard a sound. This judgment, which in no way carries with it the determination of its object, which is not accompanied by any immediate intuition, is nevertheless that which marks the point of contact with reality, that which is irreducible in experience, and without which our thought would no longer be rooted in being. It is that the capital importance of which contemporary psychologists have shown when they have tied the equilibrium of psychological life to the quote within a quote here, feeling which we have of present reality, unquote, to the quote within a quote again, reality function, end both quotes. One could say that psychology and philosophy tend toward a notion of here and now consciousness, which they need in order to account for that which is specific in perception, for the individual existences which it reveals within and outside of us. But philosophy does not possess an idea of consciousness and an idea of action which would make an internal communication between them possible. Whether consciousness be continuous duration or a center of judgments, in either case, this pure activity is without structure, without nature. Correlatively, perception and action taken in that which is specific to them, that is as the knowledge and the modification of a reality, are rejected from consciousness. It is granted that their proper function is to quote unquote root consciousness in being. but at the same time, the determination of its content is denied to the judgment of existence. It follows that the relation between what exists and the fact of existence, between the consciousness of contents and the consciousness of action which roots them in being, remains necessarily external. So Angus has posted a quote from the French text, and it actually is travail and not œuvre, so that's interesting. So here, this is like passing from the vital order to the human order and trying to figure out what is the difference between these two orders. So on the one hand, we have the human being as just a different type of animal. So bees are sensitive to polarization of light, and we are not, but we are sensitive to other um, elements of the environment or other aspects of the environment. And so you would just sort of study the human being insofar as it is capable of recognizing certain aspects of the environment and responding to them in appropriate ways. And so this would be like, identifying the human being as a certain kind of animal that has a certain kind of milieu and certain responses to the two aspects of that milieu. But then there are elements of the milieu in which humans find themselves that are in some sense specifically human. So these are the cultural objects in the broadest sense. So everything that is not just part of the biological sort of set of conditions in which humans find themselves, but that has a sort of significance to human beings. So things, the examples that he gives here are things like clothing. For example, it has this sort of function that you can specify in biological terms of protecting the organism from the elements, keeping you warm in a cold environment or protecting you from the sun or whatever. But every human society uses clothing not just for this purely instrumental purpose, but also has a sort of significance or meaning assigned to clothing. That this type of clothing is appropriate for this type of social context, maybe a wedding or a funeral or whatever, or it depicts, it portrays you as belonging to this ethnic group and not another one, or to this social class and not another one, or it's men's clothing versus women's clothing, etc. So clothing always has a significance as well as this instrumental function of protecting you from elements of the environment that could have a biological impact on you. Likewise for food, housing, etc. All these things are at the same time as having this sort of biological effect on human beings as parts of the milieu, they are also attributed a certain meaning or significance for human beings that we sort of classify or put into this giant category of culture. And so, whether, this is, again, sort of a topic of interest in animal psychology as well, like, to what extent can we talk about culture in other animals? So there's, been studies about like transmission of bird song, for example, that certain songbirds have like sort of regional dialects of their songs that the birds that grow up in one area sing the song slightly differently or have like variations on the song compared to birds in another area. And so like they're sort of learning they're learning the pattern of the song from other birds in the area. And these differences sort of get transmitted over time so that you have something like an inherited culture among these birds. But whether, it doesn't seem like any other organisms have something like this work product or, something like a cultural object in the sense that the sort of aspects of the environment that they make use of and that they shape and so on would have not just an instrumental value in performing certain biological functions, but also a kind of significance to the life of that organism. So even if you look at like chimpanzees, for example, that will use sticks to extract ants from a tree, or will use a stone to crack a nut, for example, the stick or the stone is completely instrumental for these for the chimpanzee. They just select the ones that have the right shape or structure, etc., to perform this task, and they don't like treat the stick or the stone as having some meaning or value beyond its instrumental properties. So this seems to be sort of specific to human beings of like assigning something like a value or a meaning or symbolic nature to objects, which is not reducible to their purely instrumental function of like facilitating certain biological processes or preventing dangers and so on. But so sometimes it's always difficult to figure out what so there have been instances of like animals doing things that don't have sort of an obvious instrumental function. So like Bats has posted the example here of ravens and some other birds will pick up like shiny objects and sort of collect them and put them around their nests. And it's not really clear why they would do this. Like there's no obvious sort of instrumental value to this task. It just seems like they sort of appreciate the shiny objects, as like this is cool and I like how it looks or whatever, and just sort of gather them for that reason. But yeah, you can always try to come up with an instrumental account of like why this collecting shiny objects behavior would contribute to the life project of a raven. So there's a kind of sort of proving a negative aspect to like attributing something like symbolic or cultural recognition of objects to animals. Like you'd have to say that it's hard to sort of eliminate the possibility that there's some kind of instrumental value that we just haven't been able to recognize yet. So you're kind of stuck in this like process of like one side will say, oh, this the ravens are just doing this because they appreciate the like aesthetic value of the shiny objects or whatever, and then someone else will say, oh, we can explain it in terms of this instrumental property that it has whatever utility for the life of a raven, and then they could just sort of go back and forth, debating whether this explanation is good enough or not, and so you're sort of like left with the kind of unsatisfying antinomy between this recognition or attributing a sort of cultural or symbolic recognition of the shiny objects to the raven on the one hand, and then trying to explain this behavior in terms of some sort of instrumental use of the object for the life project of a raven on the other hand. And it's hard to see how you can like get beyond that sort of opposition or like definitively show one or the other is correct in the case of animals or other organisms that have a very different life course or life project than human beings.
I've been trying to think about like how to articulate to myself recently this distinction between the significance that a perceptual situation has for a non-human animal and the significance that it can have for a symbolic form of life. Like if I hold a map up in front of my cat when she's in the kitchen, it will have some significance for the cat, because otherwise she wouldn't be able to sort of perceptually individuate it. But what it doesn't have is the significance as having expressive value. So there's an expression of significance, but it isn't expressed as being expressive. And I think it may be, with the example of the clothes, or tools, which can sometimes be very highly decorated. Maybe one way to think about those is that they have this additional sort of expressive function, which is being expressive as expressing something.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, an example of the map for like that you brought up, like the cat will obviously perceive a surface with colors on it, and the fact that you're sort of holding it probably suggests to the cat that it's something that you care about, or that is significant to you. But the cat has no like way of understanding how a map is related to practices of navigation, of measurement, and so on. All these things are completely foreign to the cat's life, and so it doesn't sort of recognize the map as like having these relations to all these other practices that humans engage in. And likewise for a code or whatever, the cat might recognize this code is associated with going outside or whatever, that there's some sort of patterns of like how this code is used, but like the fact that this code is considered stylish or not stylish, or as portraying the wearer as belonging to this subculture or whatever. These sort of symbolic properties of the code are completely irrelevant to the cat's appreciation of what the code signifies. So yeah, so there's like sort of these objects, that these cultural objects, or these objects that we attribute significance to, are embedded in these other practices of like treating the objects as having some relation to other objects and other practices that other animals are not really capable of picking up on in the way that we are. Even in like a very foreign cultural environment, we can still sort of recognize, even if we don't understand what exact significance of this object is, we can still sort of figure out that, okay, I don't know, treating this object with respect, or discarding it, or like whatever, we can sort of recognize in some very broad sense like whether or not the people are assigning some sort of value or significance to this object beyond its purely instrumental properties. Whereas, in the case of the cat observing, the human behavior, it just sort of, picks up on the ways that this object might be relevant to its life project of, getting food, going outside, these kinds of things.
I don't totally understand the criticism of Bergson and Brunschwig here, but I think it seems to be something like because they attribute this, for Bergson at least, sensation is still explained in relatively mechanistic terms, and I know common criticism of matter and memory is that Bergson doesn't convincingly explain how duration and motor habit are exactly supposed to link up, so that the conscious experience of duration is how it's supposed to connect to these purely physical extensive processes that are happening in the body. At least one criticism of Bergson is that this is left kind of mysterious, and it seems like Merleau Ponty is making a similar point here. And about Brunschwig, this idea that there's the sense of being, or the judgment of being, which is completely indeterminate, but is just a judgment that there is something. It's not clear how that sort of bare, like, thatness of the existence of something is supposed to connect to what it is that is being sensed.
Yeah, so yeah, there's a whole other sort of set of ideas that we didn't talk about in this passage. So that you brought up here. So there, I think, so Bergson is of course a kind of dualist, though not in exactly the same way that Descartes is, but like there's always like any sort of dualism raises the issue of like how these two elements or aspects of the world that are posited by this dualism are supposed to connect with each other. So for Descartes, there's like the body mind problem that he says surpasses human understanding, and we just have to sort of attribute it to the action of God, and that's all we can do. Which is obviously not a very intellectually satisfying response. And then so Bergson has this opposition between the consciousness of duration and then the interactions of extended matter in the world, so it's not exactly the same dualism, but there's still the question of like how are these elements of the world or aspects of the world connected to each other. So in this context, the question here is that, or the objection here is that by sort of assimilating human action of all sorts, any sort of relationship of human beings to parts of the extended world, by putting them all sort of in one box as like just instrumental or just responses to parts of the environment, insofar as they help us perform certain vital behaviors or biological behaviors. He's sort of not grasping the distinction between the way that other animals will respond to aspects of the environment in terms of how they either afford or prevent their behaviors versus this recognition of objects as having significance that it seems only humans are capable of. And so like by putting them all in one category, it sort of leaves him with this sort of hard to grasp what the connection would be between this sort of residue of pure duration on the one hand, and then everything else, all the sort of behaviors of human beings that affect the material world in extension on the other hand. So it's almost as if we have this like consciousness of duration just sort of added on to all the interactions of human beings with the material world on the other hand, and then it's kind of so this consciousness of duration is kind of like an extra, just sort of like painted on top of the actions of human beings in the world, and that's sort of leaves us with like I guess a sort of like the whole sort of consciousness of duration side seems superfluous in this whole picture. It's like a sort of epiphenomenon. So what Merleau-Ponty wants to do here is to sort of have a more fine-grained differentiation on the action side of how human actions can either create objects that have significance, or take already existing objects as having a certain significance, and so on. Treating a piece of furniture, a piece of clothing, a piece of food, whatever, as having the significance of being a piece of food or whatever it is that is to be treated in this specific way, as opposed to just as having a certain biological significance, as granting nutrition to you if you eat it, or something like that.
I can read next. Are we in the final analysis?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. In the final analysis, consciousness is defined by the possession of an object of thought, or by transference to itself. Action is defined by a series of events external to each other. They are juxtaposed, they are not tied together. Bergson himself pointed out what is abstract in psychologies, which describe the empirical origin of perception as if its function were immediately contemplative, as if the original and primary attitude of man were that of a spectator. But he did not follow this idea all the way. To do it justice completely, it would have been necessary, first of all, to stop defining consciousness by knowledge of self, and to introduce the notion of a life of consciousness which goes beyond its explicit knowledge of itself. But something further would also have been necessary, to describe the structures of action and knowledge in which consciousness is engaged, instead of leaving this life of consciousness indeterminate and being content with the, quote, concrete and general, unquote, as if consciousness could not go beyond the melodies of instinct without being liberated from all determinate form. Consequently, it can be seen that the psychology of perception in Bergson is not profoundly modified by the fact that he brought it closer to action, since action is still understood in the narrow sense of a vital action, and since vital action tends to adapt us to the, quote, unorganized mass, unquote, the problem is still to understand how the objects of nature are constituted for us, and the question of whether or not it is indeed to objects of this kind that human action and perception are first addressed is not asked. It has been clearly shown that animal perception is sensitive only to certain concrete stimulus wholes, the form of which is prescribed by instinct itself, and, rightly, a lived abstraction by means of which what does not correspond to the structure of the animal's instinct is left purely and simply outside its sensory field has been discussed. But the thought of relating the content of human perception to the structure of human action in the same way does not occur. Of course, it is said that our quote-unquote needs, our quote-unquote tendencies, and our attention oriented by them make the objects of our actual perception emerge from the possible sensory field. But what is ordinarily implicitly understood by this is an ensemble of qualities, color, weight, flavor, among which attention chooses, and it is from a mosaic of preconscious sensations that one tries to rejoin the actual content of infantile or original perception. The analysis is made following the same postulates which we encountered in the theory of the reflex. One tries to make a determinate content of consciousness correspond to each partial stimulus, the luminous vibration, for example, exactly as reflex theory tried to decompose the instinctive act into a sum of elementary reactions, each one of which would correspond to an elementary stimulus. And just as instinctual activity unfolds, as we have seen, according to the structures prescribed by the organism itself, one could show likewise that sensations cannot be supposed, even ideally, behind the concrete unities of original perception. But then the needs, tendencies, and acts of spontaneous attention, the forces, in a word, which are also preconscious, which must be introduced in order to reconstruct the original syncretism on the basis of pure qualities, appear in turn as hypothetical constructions, as quote-unquote faculties, which are rendered indispensable only by the myth of sensations. They are abstract ideas which are formed in order to explain the discrepancy between our de facto perception and a perception which is in principle wholly conventional. Two abstractions together do not make a concrete description. They're not these impersonal forces on the one hand, and on the other a mosaic of sensations which they would transform. There are melodic unities, significant wholes, experienced in an indivisible manner as poles of action and nuclei of knowledge. Primitive knowledge is not comparable to the result of an energic process in which the tendencies and needs would be released over a mosaic of pure qualities and would give directions to an impartial thinking subject, which it will docilely execute. Perception is a moment of the living dialectic of a concrete subject. It participates in its total structure, and correlatively, it has as its original object not the quote-unquote unorganized mass, but the actions of other human subjects. Lacking an adequate notion of real consciousness, thinkers have been led to construct perception arbitrarily and without being able to take into account its descriptive characteristics. Let us try, on the contrary, to start from these characteristics and indicate how they compel us to conceive of the structure of consciousness. Nascent perception has the double character of being directed toward human intentions rather than toward objects of nature or the pure qualities, hot, cold, white, black, of which they are the supports, and of grasping them as experienced realities rather than as true objects. The representation of the objects of nature and their qualities, the consciousness of truth, belong to a higher dialectic, and we will have to make them appear in the primitive life of consciousness, which we are trying for the moment to describe. It is a known fact that infantile perception attaches itself first of all to faces and gestures, in particular those of the mother. As long as one conserves the hypothesis of sensations, the fact may appear insignificant. The tendencies and the affections of the infant would make the face emerge from the mosaic of sensations, and the expression from the face, so that finally the sensations would become the barely conscious signs of an expression. But we have seen that the hypothesis of sensations is not justifiable. So Merleau-Ponty is criticizing Bergson of a kind of proximity to reflex theory, and of trying to explain the unity of the perceptual field in terms of pre-conscious qualities, which I guess would be a matter of just atomistic sensory excitations, which are then acted on by these forces or faculties in order to, individuate these preconscious pure qualities into objects which are relevant to the organism. But I think the criticism is that basically this is a kind of hylomorphism, which tries to explain the concrete whole of perception by abstracting two terms from either end, but misses the concreteness of what those are starting from. And this is the idea that what we perceive first is not even nature, but the other. I think is a very interesting idea. I recently read Zahavi and Gallagher's book, The Phenomenological Mind, And they cited similar studies about infantile perception and how, like, the first object to individuate for an infant is the face of faces in general, but the face of the primary caregiver. They made sort of related interesting points about how an infant can tell the difference, for instance, between talking to its mother live via video as opposed to interacting with a recording of the mother that is not, responding to the infant in the same way that the live video feed is. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I know there's been lots of studies, in that sort of vein of like this, sort of a response to the infant's response to faces, for example, and so what Merleau Ponty is going to mention in the next little bit is like this idea that so the infant is responding to something like a smile as such, or the mother's smiling face, or something like that, as opposed to like some sort of pattern of visual stimuli that is then sort of secondarily interpreted as a smile. So the sort of basic like constituents of the infant's perception are these already expressive gestures or expressions, as opposed to these like sensory qualities that it then has to sort of interpret as having a meaning. And you can think of like how hard it is actually to sort of like restrict yourself to seeing sensory qualities of objects. And so like when you someone who like wants to become a painter, for example, has to sort of discipline themselves and learn how to observe the colors and how they vary in accordance with the ambient lighting and so on. And being able to capture that is actually quite difficult, as opposed to, so like if we suppose that human perception had this sort of was sort of most immediately of these sensory qualities, it should be quite easy to like depict the pattern of colors that you are perceiving when you look at an object or a scene or whatever. But it's actually quite difficult. We have to discipline ourselves to perform that kind of seeing. And likewise, things like perspective, like linear perspective is only developed in like 15th century Europe, and involves all sorts of investigations into what we would now call projective geometry. So it's this sort of sophisticated intellectual construction to produce something like the illusion of looking into a volume that recedes behind the frame of the picture. And so if we suppose that something like this structure is like already there in our perceptual world, if we suppose that we sort of originally see two-dimensional shapes and then interpret it as having a three-dimensional structure, then it's hard to understand why it would have been such a difficult like process to actually be able to reproduce that two-dimensional depiction of a three-dimensional structure, and why it only arose in one specific cultural context that involved like all sorts of geometrical knowledge to bring about that kind of technique of linear perspective. Just the fact that it's like hard to sort of depict or reproduce what is supposedly the immediate object of perception already suggests that maybe that is not really the immediate object of perception, and we might actually be sort of looking at perception from the wrong end when we sort of try to reconstruct the concrete perception of expressive gestures and of objects as having significance in terms of this like immediate perception of something non-significant and then adding a significance on top of it. And like maybe like a simple illustration of this is this sort of naive practice that many different artistic traditions have used of like depicting the most important person or object in a scene as bigger than the others. So like the king is going to be huge and all his subjects are like little creatures like at his feet or whatever. And clearly this is not a depiction of the actual size relationships between these people in reality, or even of like a linear perspective relation of how the retinal images of these objects were projected or like how they were projected onto the retina of the painter. It's a kind of depiction of the expressive value of these people, or of the significance attributed to these people in terms of size, that yeah, it has this expressive. So the size, the size of the people on the painting is expressive of their significance and not representative of the size of the objects or of the size of the images that they project onto the retina. And so like the fact that this is like something that reappears in many artistic traditions or many different cultures as a way of depicting the importance of a person suggests that we are not sort of immediately aware of something like the size of objects or the size of retinal images, and then secondarily, you know, decide or interpret which ones are significant or not. That seems that we instead are more immediately aware of the significance of objects, and then sort of extracting something like an objective size of those objects, or a measured size, or a size in terms of retinal images. These sort of are sort of artificial and secondary ways of extracting something from our more immediate perceptual grasp of significance. And actually, it makes me think also of like how like cartoons or caricatures often are like not accurate in some sense, that they sort of exaggerate certain properties of a person or of a shape or whatever, but in many ways they're actually more expressive than the accurate depiction of the object. So you can sort of more quickly recognize the significance of a drawing of a person with exaggerated features than of a photographic depiction of that person that accurately portrays the person's real features. The person's like sort of qualities or significance stand out from the caricature in a way that they don't from the photo, or less immediately from the photo. So like this sort of exaggeration or distortion of features that is performed in this caricature process sort of helps us or enables us to grasp the significance of the person in a way that the accurate depiction of the features of the person is sort of less effective at.
Yeah,
Been
that's
reading.
of,
So go ahead, Bess.
I was gonna say that that's kind of the beautiful thing about a painting, right? That or a drawing. That if I were to draw someone, even if I try to make it realistic, unless I'm going like the extra mile to be like a hyper realist or something, in which case we end up with this kind of like paradoxical thing in which we have this painting that is more detailed than any detail that I'm actually like aware of at any given moment, right? But if we don't go to those extremes, whenever I'm painting like a face or a scenery or something like that, ultimately I'm painting my own interpretation of it, right? Or what is striking about it to me, right? So that filter of the artist is always going to be there. It's that's I think one of the most easily like one of the differences between painting and drawing and stuff like that and photographs that is more easily like remarkable, right? Even in its most realistic traditions, there's still a certain subjectivity to it, I think. Although you could argue that, like in a photograph, choosing what to photograph and so on, like the subjectivity is still there, but it lies elsewhere, I think.
I've been reading some Husserl scholarship and Cartesian meditations, and it's interesting that at least on the basis of my knowledge of Husserl, it kind of takes him a while. I mean, Cartesian meditations is not like it's not an early lecture, but that the move from like the fourth to the fifth meditation is this the thematization of intersubjective transcendental phenomenology, and how the like transcendence of the object in the strong sense really depends on the presence of the other, implicit or explicit. It's interesting in light of the points about the primacy of the perception of the face in infancy. I think that Husserl, was well aware of the importance of intersubjectivity kind of the whole time, but it's sort of comes last in the order of methodology, even though it's sort of first in the order of being, I guess.
Yeah, I think Husserl always has this sort of inside out progression where you start from immediate personal or like one person's consciousness of I perceive objects surrounding me and so on, and then sort of progressing outwards from there to how I relate to other subjects and to objects that have cultural significance and so on. I think Merleau-Ponty, he doesn't, I think in this book, sort of directly criticize Husserl for that approach, but I think he wants to, I don't think he would see that as like an adequate way of grasping something like the significance of cultural objects. The idea that we could like first start with, this sort of experience of seeing a table or whatever, and then progress from there to like recognizing the table as having significance for a specific cultural tradition and so on. I think for Merleau-Ponty, this is sort of like repeating the same kind of move of like, the sort of intellectualist move of like the same way that like you would start from something like the stimulus, this like atomic stimulus, and try to figure out how somehow in the brain the stimulus gets processed and connected to other stimuli and like brings about something like a perception of the object, and all the criticisms that he gave of that process. I think he would see this sort of progression as sort of repeating the same mistake. But yeah, so like I think in this book so like a lot of these materials were of Husserl were not published. He did have access to the archives, so he does refer to some unpublished material, but I think maybe in some of his later work he engages with that a bit more and has like more of an analysis of where he sort of differentiates himself from Husserl. But yeah, to go back to the bit about like photography, I think it's not a coincidence that you have like impressionism and this sort of trajectory that leads to something like abstract painting happening, from the sort of mid 19th century when photography also arises. Where like the fact that we can now produce these like accurate or quasi objective depictions of people and objects and scenery and so on using this mechanical process or this chemical process of photography now means that this idea of painting as sort of reproducing the scene or the object is kind of less relevant, and then this other aspect of like the grasping the significance or the expressive value of this person or scene is sort of comes to prominence, and so like painting sort of becomes an exploration of that expressive value as such, as opposed to like sort of using a scene or a person depiction to express something. It's a sort of like purification of painting as this purely expressive process or medium, as opposed to like having the expressive value of a scene be sort of implicit in the depiction of that scene in quasi-realistic terms. Yeah, so you have like people like Turner, for example, will like you have a painting that says like a view of the harbor or whatever, but it's just like completely just color patches on a canvas, and so like you just sort of have to take his word for it that it was like inspired by looking at a harbor in the fog or whatever. But and that, or like Monet, likewise will have something that's something that's like the title will make reference to like lilies in a pond or something, but again, it's just like different color patches on the canvas. So Angus has posted a Turner painting, which is an example of this sort of light filtered through a fog or a cloud or something, that it is just sort of realized as different color patches on a canvas. So these sort of paintings are maybe biographically inspired by an observation of a scene or an object or whatever, but in terms of like the actual realization on a canvas and what you see when you go to a gallery and look at it, they have like no sort of realistic representational content. Like there's no way to sort of look at the painting and say, oh, this is a painting of the harbor or whatever it is. So yeah, this sort of the sort of grasp of the significance or meaning of this view of the harbor is sort of extricated from the representation of that view of the harbor on the canvas. And so what we are, as the viewer of the painting, we have to sort of grasp the significance of what these color patches are expressing, as opposed to like sort of seeing the objects that maybe inspired the painter to produce this painting.
Yeah, it's interesting to talk about late Impressionism and post-Impressionism with respect to Merleau Ponty, in part because he wrote so much about Cézanne, but also because I think some of the like Matisse, for instance, in trying to sort of liberate some of the formal elements of painting from naturalistic representation, was tried to do so by finding a way to give the painting a formal unity, which was, a non-naturalistic formal unity, which maybe can be thought alongside Gestalt theories of perception.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know that some of the Impressionists were very interested in psychology. I don't know if any of them sort of studied Gestalt psychology specifically, but yeah, I forget the name of it. There was this sort of like instrument that some of them came up with or started using, where they would like, it was like a tiny view hole where you would like put it up in front of your eye and see only the color of one sort of patch of the scene that you were looking at, and then you would paint that little patch with this color. And then you would move on to another patch and so on. And so like you would have like a painting of say like a snow under a street light. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so this pointiest approach to color depiction. So like, yeah, a painting of snow under a street light, you would have the snow might be like yellow directly under the light and blue at a further distance, and then maybe black in the background or whatever. Even though if you like if you're in that real scene looking at the streetlight, the snow might look white in some sense because you have this color constancy process that we talked about before, where like you are somehow accommodating for the ambient lighting when you perceive the color of the snow surface. But then when you use this little instrument to view only one little patch at a time, you can sort of extract the like sort of non constant color from this scene that you otherwise would see under the operation of color constancy. Yeah, so like there's like this other sort of approach to grasping aspects of the scene or of the perceived object that that like are sort of pursued and explored in, yeah, I guess like the whole trajectory of painting after, like from the Impressionist movement onwards, that are not about sort of depicting the object in such a way that the painting looks like or represents the object. But yeah, so sort of extracting something from the perception of a scene or an object or a person that allows you to grasp a meaning or this sort of idea that is embodied in that object or person, as opposed to like the sort of representation of what you see when you look at that object. And it's also interesting that like, you know, some of these painters that are considered like, you know, very sort of classical today, you know, Impressionists or Cézanne or Van Gogh, whoever, you know, at the time were considered like, these were sort of, there was like violent opposition to some of these people, that like they were, you know, excluded from galleries, you know, lived in poverty, etc. That like people, like there's this sort of, yeah, very like strong affective rejection of this whole idea of like this sort of non-representational way of grasping the idea expressed in a scene. Yeah, so like, yeah, you can see how this is like a sort of there's a lot more going on than just like, you know, sort of choosing to represent other aspects of a scene. It's something that like yeah, I mean, I don't have a sort of a good account of like why exactly this is so troubling for people in this tradition, but yeah, there's like there's a lot more significance to this choice to depict the color patterning minus color constancy or before color constancy, for example, or the depict the experience of sunlight filtering through the fog as opposed to a realistic depiction of the harbor. Like these choices are there's a lot more significance to those choices than just like a different approach to painting or something like that.
It says on the bridge and dam at Pontoise.
Nice. Yeah, I know. Like at Cezanne, like in particular, like yeah, he has all these like countless studies of these like very similar landscapes in Provence, and like different angles on rocks and the way that the sun is striking them, and like how the path sort of meets the rocks and so on. Yeah, and so like he's sort of grasping something about this landscape that is not sort of reducible to like yeah the geometrical relationships of one rock to another and so on. Okay, so I think we're pretty much at time, so we can stop here and pick up from there on the next one. Yeah, I don't know if he talks about painting at all in this book, but yeah, that is something that he in other texts of his, it's a sort of a constant reference point. Yeah, like how painting relates to perception and expresses something in perception and so on. So yeah, that's a pretty cool topic, I think, in relation to Merleau-Ponty's writing.
Agreed. Yeah, it's fun to go a bit over time talking about painting.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, okay. So thanks everyone for your contributions, and hope to see you next week.